This is Sound and Vision from KEXP in Seattle. Bratmobile was one of the most visible bands of the feminist punk rock riot grrrl movement in the early 90s. As part of KEXP's Northwest music column Throwaway Style, Martin Douglas spoke with the founding members Allison Wolfe and Molly Newman. In this excerpt, they talked about activism, the origins of Bratmobile, and the riot grrrl scene.
I am very interested in your background in activism before you started the band. Could you expound on your parents' involvement in activists or political spaces and how it influenced each of you from childhood?
Yeah, I grew up in Washington, D.C. My parents both worked in politics, like mainstream politics, I guess. My dad worked for a few different congressmen as I was growing up, and then worked for the DNC. So I was already around public policy and government relations and things like that, which is pretty mainstream, not necessarily activist. But as I was growing up in Washington, D.C., the times of, which was when apartheid was still in place. And, as someone growing up in a time when Roe was legal, but, kind of learning about my own reproductive rights and knowing that the fight against Roe was sort of always present. Those are kind of two pillars of my knowledge and inspiration for things that I wanted to fight against. And yeah, that there was sort of like an interesting time for me in that environment, but that definitely informed when I met Allison and the sort of phase of life that we were in. But she had such a different, unique experience too.
Molly, I don't know if you want to talk about it, but weren't you volunteering for some nonprofits or some organizations before I met you? And did you have a funeral in Oakland before I met? Well,
I was two things there. Yeah. So when I was in high school, I worked for an organization one summer called the Children's Defense Fund, which tries to support children's rights and fight poverty. Well, the biggest campaign that I worked on that was present then was the adolescent teen pregnancy prevention campaign. But yeah, I was in high school and in my first year of college, I was really interested in the Black Panther Party and learning about that. And I happened to be in Oakland when Huey Newton died. So you're right, Allison. I did go to the Huey Newton's funeral.
Oh, wow. I mean, yeah, we can't leave
It's a little bit of a weird thing for an 18-year-old white kid to do. But I went by myself and it was a really emotional experience.
Yeah. Didn't you take a few buses to get there? I think it's important.
I did take a couple buses. Yeah. I didn't have my own car.
Anyways. So that's the Molly I met, in the dorms. But I was coming maybe from a more like personalist political avenue. I don't know. It was like my mom was a real activist, really. After she divorced my dad, she came out as a lesbian, a vegetarian for a year, kind of hippie, whatever, and activist. And she'd take us to No Nukes rallies and things like that. And she would march in, pride marches in the tiny towns that we were living in and eventually Olympia, but it was tiny back then. And she started the first women's health clinic in Olympia, Washington. And that was like in 1980 or 81. And so, yeah, I mean, and that was a big challenge, really. And she had this goal in mind to have it be like feminist healthcare by, for, about women. But, she had a lot of challenges. Like it was hard for her to even get a loan to start the clinic because she was an unmarried woman, And so like, where's your husband to sign for this? So all this kind of stuff. And she got targeted a lot by anti-reproductive rights people, like the Christian right, basically. And, harassed a lot. And, people would harass us as well. Like people threw rocks at our windows. Just a lot of weird stuff would happen. because of this work that my mom did. She also performed rape kits on call at her office. This is before they were routinely done at hospitals. And for the times that she did testify in court on a woman's behalf, often she was, I don't know, sent death threats from convicted men, or even if they weren't convicted, I suppose, but angry men. So a lot of stuff like that. And she was really an out lesbian and, spoke out for LGBTQ plus rights and all that kind of stuff. She was pretty outspoken. She loved a challenge.
Yeah, she had an air of fearlessness. I'm sure she, like most humans, there's the fear in there, but that was definitely like the energy that Allison's mom projected. She didn't really take any crap. She didn't really suffer any fools, including me and Allison's other friends.
Yeah. And she wore like a flap jacket to work and had a Glock in a fanny pack that she brought, as self-defense. So
yeah,
pretty wild.
Wow. That's all incredible stuff. Tell me about creating the zine Girl Germs and how that transitioned into forming Bratmobile.
I think originally we were going to do a radio show and call it Girl Germs, and that the radio station didn't really come together, so we decided to make the zine. And they might have all happened anyway, even if the radio show had happened, because our friends were, making fanzines or people that we knew about, we were finding out about fanzines. A lot of them were talking about girls and women making music. And so I think it was all kind of coming together in that way. But then we did sort of declare that we were a band. And then someone said, well, if you're a band, like come and play the show in 6 months. And so we, took that on and decided to, we had to write some songs and someone had to learn how to play some kind of instrument to go along with it, because it was just the two of us. And that was how we played our first show.
Molly.
As people who were very much in the thick of its creation, what was that initial spark of the Riot Girl movement like?
I mean, I just see it as like kind of really a lot of Kathleen Hanna. She was working at a domestic violence shelter at the time and rape crisis center as well. And I don't know. I think a lot of it was also that the first Gulf War was happening at the same time. And a lot of guys in our scene who we knew were actually, there had been a mention of a potential draft, and they were all scared of getting sent away, understandably. But I think that Kathleen kind of sometimes questioned, like, well, okay, but what about the war at home, the war on women? And so a lot of this political awareness, which of course affected us directly, came into our dialogue, came into our kind of networking and meetings, our fanzines and our songs. And then I guess all of this talk and stuff kind of eventually became Riot Girl.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the idea really with Riot Girl was also like Molly and I, for example, were in women's studies and such classes at U of O. And I do remember at some point in class, maybe using the word girl to talk about ourselves or to talk about other women and just kind of being like, and people correcting us sometimes. I mean, not our teacher necessarily, but like other students. And I remember thinking, well, what about the lives of young girls? Like, why is that never really discussed so much in feminism or academic feminism? And why aren't those lives considered as much or something? And also thinking about this idea of uplifting what's been traditionally considered girly culture or women's work and all that kind of stuff, right? These spaces that are diminished because they're relegated as like whatever, women or something, or girls or whatever. So I think a big part of Riot Girl too was to make academic feminism, or make feminism less academic, I suppose, and speak more to like, I guess, regular people or something like that, but also to make our punk rock worlds more feminist. So I guess making feminism more punk and making punk more feminist.
I think there was like definitely a need for community also, kind of like along the lines of what Allison was describing. Like, we wanted the environment and our atmosphere. Like it was pretty intense, like there was slam dancing was a real thing. Mosh pits were a real thing. We would go to shows and come home with, totally bruised knees because even we wanted to be up front by the bands. We wanted to like be dancing as close as we possibly could to the band, but that meant that we were going to get slammed and kind of bruised and injured in a way. And,
Yeah.
and I think like that was definitely not the goal. We didn't want to feel that way. And part of it was, so if there are more women and girls who feel safe and are present and in front, like maybe that whole dynamic will shift too. And that would be great. And so how to connect with other girls. And that was what I think the fanzine Riot Girl was really kind of like, almost like a flyer that it became like, it's just one piece of paper that we folded into four. So it was, like it was actually like, hey, come to this meeting. That's the original zine, if you will. And it was like a tool, hey, come hang out. And then that was the first Riot Girl meeting. And then, that it was never an organized, not to say there was an organization behind it, but it wasn't like a designed, like we're going to have a leader and we're going to have these committees. And, like I work in business. So I have a lot of sort of org design things in my brain at all times. And it was definitely a self-organizing, self-realizing kind of thing, which was inspired by what we were learning about, the movement that had come before us, whether it was women, through women's studies or, Black studies or ethnic studies. There was that was a real tradition that we were inspired by.
The interesting thing to me about Riot Girl is the way that it was miscontextualized and how everyone was kind of put into different little boxes. And I think about how Riot Girl has been stereotyped, and the stereotype has kind of stood the test of time as like a white girl thing. But Bratmobile was, y'all were reading Eldridge Cleaver and writing about hip hop in your zine. Can you count the ways in which Riot Girl was being shortchanged by being stereotyped and placed in these little boxes?
Well, I don't know. I don't want to say that these claims are invalid or anything. You know what I mean? That's like, for sure, it probably, or it wasn't intersectional enough. But you're right. It doesn't mean that we're already reading and thinking intersectionally,
Yeah, and doing the work. Yeah.
Having that word back. Yeah. So, and I think a lot of things that we discussed or read about or, even just discussed in each other's apartments or bedrooms or whatever are things that are actually part of a mainstream conversation now. And it wasn't just us. There's a lot of other thinkers back then, alternative thinkers who were also discussing all these things. It's just, it wasn't part of mainstream discussion or whatever. So,
right.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you think, Molly?
No, I think it's important to think with a critical lens about, everything and, but also recognize the need and the response from, the circumstances that we were in. Certainly there's a whole spectrum, even within maybe the people that you might most identify with Riot Girl, the members of Bikini Kill or Kathleen and Toby particularly, and Allison and me particularly, and, and a few others. Like, even though we might look pretty homogenous as white women, we also come from a whole spectrum of, economic experience and cultural experience. And, it's not, there's no perfect analysis. It would be certainly great. I think even in real time at the time, there was, legitimate critique around, what was perceived to be, was a homogenous kind of group. But, that doesn't exclude it from being valuable and critical for other progress that I think we can sort of see evidence of still today. I don't accept that music specifically and society for sure is, by any means the power structure is like balanced and right at all. But there's been some incremental improvement that, I think sort of some of it tracks back to the work that we did. And so I'm very proud of all of this, even if I think, like the critique is legit. It's worth thinking about and talking about.
Well, also, I think it's important to recognize, although I should be prepared to say a bunch of names, but I think it's important to recognize the people who were involved in Riot Girl who don't fit that, whatever, white middle class, whatever, So, there were some people like Ramdasha Baksim who did Gunk fanzine, really important to Riot Girl. She also does complain about the lack of diversity within it at the time, and has spoken about it since as well. And there's just, a lot of other people. And so I don't want to erase them. And sometimes it's also, a part of like who gets to write history and who gets written in and out of history. It's like these women were there, and they should be, like talked about more, and their work should be seen more.
That was Elson Wolf and Molly Newman of the Riot Girl band Bratmobile speaking with KEXP's Martin Douglas. You can read a longer version of this conversation as part of Martin's Throwaway Style column. Check it out at kexp.org, and we'll also post a link in the podcast description. That was Sound and Vision. Please take a moment to subscribe to this podcast, rate it, and review it. Those little things go a long way in helping others know that this podcast exists and is worthy of their time. We're also toying with some new ideas for the show in the future, so I am really curious. If you listen to the show on a regular basis, I would love some feedback on what you think is working, what's not working, what you really like, maybe what you don't like. Share it with me. Send me an email at soundandvision@kexp.org. Thanks so much for listening.